On the morning of December 17, 1944, an SS colonel named Joachim Peiper stood in the wet square of a small Belgian town called Bulge and watched 50 American prisoners of war pour gasoline into the fuel tanks of his Panthers and Tigers. Peiper was 29 years old. He commanded the lead armoured spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, the personal bodyguard regiment of Adolf Hitler, and he had begun this offensive less than 24 hours earlier, with only half the fuel his tanks needed to reach their objective. The town square he stood in had been, in happier days, the local cattle market. Now it was filled with the smell of high-octane American gasoline and the silence of frightened young men in olive drab being made to refuel the tanks that had just killed their friends. 8 months later, in a prisoner-of-war compound at Freising in Bavaria, an American interrogator named Major Kenneth Hechler sat across a table from this same Joachim Peiper. Hechler was a historian in uniform. He had come to take Peiper's complete account of those 9 days in the Ardennes, and toward the end of a very long interview, Hechler leaned forward and asked Peiper a question that changed the way historians have thought about the Battle of the Bulge ever since. Hechler asked Peiper whether he had realized on the night of December 18, 1944, that his lead Panther tank had come to a halt within 300 yards of an American fuel dump containing approximately 3 million gallons of gasoline. Hechler later wrote in his official report what happened next. Peiper shrugged his shoulders. He smiled, just slightly, in a way Hechler described as arrogant. And then the SS colonel whose battle group had committed the Malmedy massacre 8 months before answered in English. 2 words. He said, "I am sorry." That moment, in that room in Freising, is the moment this story is really about, because the question is not why the Germans lost the Battle of the Bulge. Every honest German general from Gerd von Rundstedt down to a corporal in a half-track knew the offensive was doomed before it began. The question is why captured German soldiers walked through American supply depots after the surrender, kept saying the same thing over and over again. Why men who had fought from the gates of Moscow to the Caucasus oil fields stood in front of American fuel dumps and could not believe what they were looking at. The answer to that question lies in 2 numbers. The Germans started the Ardennes offensive with roughly 4 million gallons of motor fuel for the entire operation. A single American First Army fuel dump in the woods between Spa and Stavelot held between 2 and 3 million gallons of gasoline, 1 depot, in 1 piece of forest, in 1 quiet corner of Belgium. This is the story of how that gap between those 2 numbers killed Hitler's last hope, and how a young SS colonel named Joachim Peiper walked, drove, and finally crawled past mountains of American gasoline he did not even know existed. By the autumn of 1944, the German war machine was running on fumes in the most literal sense possible. The Allied bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel production had broken the back of the Reich's energy economy. In April of 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel plants had produced 316,000 metric tons of fuel in a single month. By September of 1944, that figure had collapsed to 17,000 tons. That is not a decline. That is a 95% destruction of a nation's strategic energy base in 5 months. The man who oversaw German armaments and war production, Albert Speer, sent a memorandum to Adolf Hitler on the 30th of June, 1944. In it, Speer wrote that the enemy had succeeded in increasing German aviation gasoline losses up to 90% by the 22nd of June. After the great oil raids of May 12th, Speer recalled that Hitler had said something that, in hindsight, sounds almost suicidal. Hitler said the enemy had struck Germany at one of her weakest points, and that if the Americans persisted, Germany would soon have no fuel production worth mentioning. Then Hitler added that his one hope was that the other side had an Air Force general staff as scatterbrained as his own. The Allies, of course, did not. By December of 1944, the Wehrmacht had end-of-year aviation gasoline reserves of 146,000 tons. 12 months earlier, that figure had been 440,000 tons. 67% of the Reich's air fuel reserve had simply vanished. And yet, in this catastrophe, Adolf Hitler decided to launch the largest German offensive in the West since the fall of France in 1940. The plan was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, The objective was Antwerp, the great Belgian port through which the Americans and British were now landing the supplies that were strangling Germany. 3 German armies, 2 of them Panzer armies, would smash through the thinly held Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, and drive 125 miles northwest to seize Antwerp and split the Allied armies in half. The Supreme Command had promised the assault forces approximately 4 million gallons of motor fuel from the Führer Reserve, the sacrosanct strategic stockpile. The Chief of Operations, General Oberst Alfred Jodl, confirmed this allocation in his post-war interrogation. The reality on the ground was different. The OB West Chief Armoured Officer, General Horst Stumpf, told American interrogators in 1945 what had actually happened. Stumpf said the bulk of the fuel reserves were located along the Rhine River, and once it snowed, those reserves could not be brought forward because of the intolerable road conditions. The trains could not run. Allied fighter bombers ruled the daylight skies. The fuel that Hitler had promised was sitting in rail yards 200 miles east of where it was needed. On the 14th of December, 1944, 2 days before the offensive was to begin, the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, Joachim Peiper, attended a division conference at a small town in the Eifel Hills called Tondorf. There he heard the regimental commander, Wilhelm Mohnke, deliver a piece of news that would shape everything that followed. In his interrogation 8 months later, Peiper recalled what Mohnke had said. 2 trainloads of gasoline, urgently needed for the offensive, had not arrived. And because of that, orders were issued to all units to supply themselves with captured gasoline. Let those words sit for a moment. A regimental commander of the Waffen-SS was being told, in advance, that his offensive would have to refuel itself from American supply depots it had not yet captured. The next day, the 15th of December, Peiper attended a corps-level conference. There, the Chief of Staff of 1st SS Panzer Corps, a man named Lehmann, announced that the expected gasoline still had not arrived, but that the Führer had insisted the offensive would begin on the 16th, notwithstanding. When Hechler asked Peiper, in that room at Freising in September of 1945, what had happened to the missing gasoline, Peiper gave an answer that captured the whole disintegrating logic of the German war effort. He said, "Oh, he guessed it was delayed, rerouted, and may have arrived later on in some other area, but they never saw it." It is worth being precise about what Peiper started with. In his follow-up interrogation, the document called Ethint 11, Peiper stated that at the time of the initial assault, his tanks had only enough gas for approximately 50 miles of operation. He described this as approximately 1/2 of the basic load, without any reserve. The objective was the Meuse River. The Meuse, at the nearest point, was more than 90 miles away. Antwerp was 125 miles away. The fuel consumption of a King Tiger heavy tank, a 68-ton monster of a vehicle, was roughly 2 American gallons per mile on a good paved road, and considerably more in the hilly, muddy lanes of the Ardennes. The arithmetic was not difficult. The arithmetic was impossible. Hechler, in that long September interview at Freising, asked Peiper one more question that historians have never quite been able to forget. He asked whether Peiper had known, before the attack began, where to expect to find captured gasoline. Peiper answered without hesitation. He said his division's intelligence officer had a situation map purporting to show American supply installations, and from that map, Peiper said, they believed they could capture gasoline at Bullingen and at Stavelot. This is one of the most important sentences in the entire post-war German military record. It tells us that German intelligence, in December of 1944, had identified the locations of specific American fuel dumps. It tells us that German planning was not merely hoping to capture American fuel as a happy windfall, it was depending on it. The map was the plan. There is only one problem. The map was incomplete. The Germans had identified the medium-sized supply dumps along the obvious approach routes. They had not located, because they could not locate, the truly massive 1st Army Class 3 fuel installations hidden in the deep pine woods between the resort town of Spa and the bridge town of Stavelot. Those depots held, between them, somewhere between 2 million and 3 million American gallons of gasoline. They were the largest forward fuel reserves in the entire Allied logistics network in northwest Europe. The 6th Panzer Army had been allocated, on paper, fewer than 4.5 million gallons for the entire offensive, A single American depot, in a quiet Belgian forest, held nearly as much fuel as Sepp Dietrich's entire army. The Germans had no idea. The offensive began in the freezing pre-dawn dark of the 16th of December, 1944. By nightfall, despite ferocious American resistance on Elsenborn Ridge to the north, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had begun grinding westward through the broken roads of the Eifel. He was already burning fuel faster than expected. Peiper would later tell Hechler that by the time he reached the town of Lochheim, his column had used as much gasoline in 25 kilometers as he would normally have expected to use in 50, because of the mountainous terrain. Around 4 in the morning on the 17th, his lead elements rolled into a village called Honsfeld. The defenders were rear-area American troops, half asleep, badly equipped, scattered. The town fell within minutes. And here, almost as soon as American hands went up in surrender, the killing began. The historian Rick Atkinson, in his book The Guns at Last Light, describes what happened. 8 American soldiers, rousted into the street in their underwear and bare feet, shouting the word "Kamerad," were lined up against a wall and shot with a machine gun. They were the first 19 unarmed American prisoners murdered that morning, but they would not be the last. By dawn, Peiper had a decision to make. His assigned route ran westward toward the village of Schoppen, on a poor dirt road bogged in winter mud. But there was a better paved road north through Bullingen. As Peiper would later admit to Hechler, one thing influenced his decision. He had been told that an American gasoline dump existed at Bullingen, and his unit, he said, was already running low on gasoline. Peiper diverted north. Around 7 in the morning, his Panthers and half-tracks rolled into Bullingen. The defenders were stunned. The town held elements of the headquarters of Major General Walter Lauer's 99th Infantry Division, the Quartermaster Company of the 2nd Infantry Division, and a scattering of artillery liaison troops. On a hastily cleared field on the edge of town sat about a dozen L-4 Cub light aircraft, the unarmed spotter planes American artillery officers used to direct fire. German machine gunners walked along the airstrip and raked each one in turn. And then they came to the fuel dump. The exact figure Peiper captured at Bullingen, as he himself stated it under interrogation, was 200,000 litres. In American measure, that is approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline. What Peiper did next, he described to Hechler in 2 short sentences. He said, "Of course, they found it. They captured 200,000 litres in Bullingen and used 50 American prisoners to fill all of their tanks. This," Peiper said, "was a lucky break." Atkinson found the records of that scene. Several American soldiers, hiding in a cellar of a house on the edge of town, strangled their pet dog to keep her from barking. 200 other men were rounded up. Before being marched east to prison cages, those GIs were forced to fuel the Panzers with 5-gallon jerrycans in the open square at the center of town, the square that in happier days had served as the local cattle market. For 2.5 hours, somewhere between 7 and 10 in the morning, Joachim Peiper stood in that square and watched American boys hand-pour American fuel into the tanks that would carry him deeper into Belgium. Then the column moved on. Before the Germans left Bullingen, they murdered 50 more unarmed American prisoners of war. The figures from the post-war Senate investigation of the Malmedy massacre, the official record catalogued at the National Archives, are exact. 19 at Honsfeld, 50 at Bullingen. The killings would continue all day. About 2.5 hours after leaving Bullingen, Peiper's lead column rolled to a stop at a country crossroads called Bognes, just south of the town of Malmedy. A small American convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion had run directly into them. The Americans were quickly disarmed and herded into a snowy field beside the road. Approximately 86 unarmed American prisoners of war were shot down where they stood. The killings at the Bognes crossroads would become known to the world simply as the Malmedy massacre. It was the worst single atrocity committed against American prisoners of war in the European theatre. Peiper, his tanks now topped off with American gasoline, drove on. By dusk on the 17th of December, Peiper's lead vehicles had pushed into a deep valley along the Obstlt River. They were tantalizingly close, by his own later admission, to the open road to the Meuse. They had moved nearly 30 miles in a single day, an extraordinary advance for an armoured column in winter terrain. The combined American defense north of him was being shredded. And here, less than 3 miles east of the village of Stavelot, Joachim Peiper made the single decision that would, in the end, doom his entire campaign. He stopped for the night. The hour was dusk. His tanks were tired. His men had been awake for nearly 48 hours. The lead bridge over the Obstlt at Stavelot lay ahead in the fading light, defended by, at that moment, almost nothing. Peiper would later admit, with the bitterness of hindsight, that had he pushed on through the night, he would have crossed the bridge without serious resistance and rolled straight into the heart of the American supply zone. He did not push on. He halted. This was the single greatest American break of the entire Ardennes campaign. Because 18 miles north of where Peiper had stopped, in the dark forests around the village of Francorchamps and along the road south from Spa, lay between 2 and 3 million gallons of American gasoline. The official army history, written by the historian Hugh and published by the Center of Military History in 1965, is precise about what was there. Cole wrote that the most important item in that region was the great store of gasoline, over 2 million gallons, in dumps just north of the two towns. The British historian Peter Caddick-Adams, in his Ardennes account Snow and Steel, goes further. Caddick-Adams describes United States Fuel Depot No. 3 on the road from Francorchamps to Stavelot as containing up to 3 million gallons of gasoline. The fuel was not in tanks. It was stacked in 5-gallon American jerrycans, hundreds of thousands of them, piled in long lines under the cover of the pine trees along a 5-mile stretch of forest road. Each jerrycan was guarded against the weather by trees and against the enemy by a small force of 60 men from the 5th Belgian Fusilier Battalion, attached to the American 12th Army Group, plus a single platoon of the 3,814th Quartermaster Gasoline Supply Company of 1st United States Army, 60 Belgian Fusiliers, 1 platoon of black American truck drivers and gas handlers, 3 million gallons of high-octane fuel, and, less than 20 miles south of all of it, sleeping in their tanks in the dark, the lead spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. If Peiper had crossed the bridge at Stavelot on the night of the 17th, the road north was his. He could have rolled up the highway to Francorchamps before dawn. He could have driven his Tigers and Panthers between the endless rows of stacked American jerrycans. He could have refueled an entire Panzer Corps from a single American forest. He could have driven to Antwerp. He did not know it was there. The morning of the 18th of December, 1944, opened with one of those small, almost invisible American actions that decide the fate of armies. Major Paul Solis was an officer of the 526th Armored Infantry Battalion. He had been sent rushing south the previous night to plug whatever hole he could find. By mid-morning on the 18th, with Peiper's tanks now grinding through Stavelot, Solis understood that the road north led to Depot No. 3 and millions of gallons of American gasoline. He had perhaps an hour before German reconnaissance might come up that road. What Solis did has become one of the iconic small unit acts of the Western War. Hugh, in the official army history, describes it in language that is deliberately spare. Solis seized some of the gasoline from the Francorchamps dump. He had his men pour it out in a deep road cut, where there was no turnout. He set it ablaze. The result, Cole writes, was a perfect anti-tank barrier. 5-gallon American jerrycans, one after another, broken open and emptied into a defile of the road, a flame so high and so hot that no armoured vehicle on earth could pass through it. Cole gives the exact amount Solis burned, 124,000 gallons, but the part of the story that matters most is not the fire. The part of the story that matters most is what was happening, simultaneously, half a mile to the south. While Solis burned his barrier, every working truck within 30 miles was racing to evacuate the rest of the depot. A private first class named Theo Lauter of the 3,814th Quartermaster Gasoline Supply Company later gave testimony, preserved in the Belgian Veterans' Archives, about what that evacuation looked like. Lauter said the evacuation of the fuel was being carried out, that there were trucks from just about every unit in First Army, and that most of the fuel was safely removed. A captain named Joseph Wilson, of the 5th Corps Quartermaster Section, commandeered every truck he could find under written authorization and evacuated approximately 2 million gallons of petroleum products to a railhead farther in the rear. a sergeant of the 147th Signal Company, attached to the 7th Armoured Division, named James Duncan, gave a combat interview on the 31st of December, 1944. He described how a Lieutenant Combs had discovered an abandoned ration dump and a gas dump of about 1 million gallons, and how, in his exact words, a coloured trucking outfit with large trucks was loading and carting away the cans of gas. That coloured trucking outfit was almost certainly a quartermaster truck company of the kind that had been driving the Red Ball Express, the great American supply lifeline of the previous autumn. By the time the 83rd day of the Red Ball Express ended on the 16th of November, those mostly African-American truck drivers had hauled 412,000 to 193 tons of supplies forward from the Normandy beaches. On the 18th of December, they did it again, on a smaller scale, in a single afternoon, with German tanks audible in the next valley. It is one of the unsung facts of the Ardennes campaign. The men who saved the great fuel reserve at Francorchamps, on the day the Battle of the Bulge hung on a single roll of dice, were largely black American truck drivers, working under fire, in the cold of a Belgian forest, while their flag refused to acknowledge them as full citizens at home. While Solis was burning his barrier and the trucks were running, the rest of the 18th of December was deciding Peiper's fate in another way entirely. Peiper, having turned west out of Stavelot rather than north up the Francorchamps road, was now running into a series of American engineer battalions that would simply not let him cross water. At 11:45 in the morning, near the town of Trois-Ponts, a captain named Sam Schäuber of C Company, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, blew the Amblève River Bridge in the face of Peiper's lead Panther. A lone 57mm anti-tank gun from the 526th Armoured Infantry Battalion got off one shot. It hit the lead Panther. 4 American gunners were killed by the German return fire. They had bought the engineers their minute. The bridge went down. Peiper's first westward route closed. Peiper turned north along the Amblève, then west again, looking for another crossing. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, low cloud broke just long enough for a flight of American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons to find his column in the open near the village of Cheneux. They destroyed approximately 12 vehicles, including 2 Panthers. And then, at 4:45 in the afternoon, came the most famous of the engineer fights. A young first lieutenant named Alvin Edelstein of a company, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, blew the timber trestle bridge over the Lienne River at Habiamont, just as Peiper's lead Panthers came around the bend. According to multiple German post-war accounts, including those collected by Peter Caddick-Adams, Peiper screamed 3 words at the burning timbers across the gorge. He said, in German, "Diese verdammten Ingenieur," those damned engineers. He turned back toward the river valley, took shelter for the night in a Belgian aristocrat's chateau called Freudcourt, and began to understand, that night, that the road to the Meuse was closing. Just before midnight, 20 miles to the south, a Captain Leland Kofer of a company, 105th Engineer Combat Battalion of the 30th Infantry Division, dropped the stone bridge over the Amblève at Stavelot with 20 50-pound boxes of TNT. When the Associated Press reporter Hal Boyle reached him hours later and asked whether any German tank could now ford the river there, Kofer gave him a sentence that ended up in newspapers across the United States. Kofer said, "No German tank can jump that." Peiper, on the morning of the 19th of December, was trapped. He had a Panzer division on the western side of a series of blown bridges, with the Americans now in his rear, his communications cut, his Luftwaffe air supply drops mostly landing in American hands, and his fuel state critical. He still had no idea that, in the pine forests north of Stavelot that his lead troops had never reached, millions of gallons of American gasoline were being trucked away to the rear, jerrycan by jerrycan, loaded onto the beds of Quartermaster Corps Studebakers and driven east in convoy, while a few hundred yards of high-octane flame in a deep road cut kept any opportunistic German push to the north on the wrong side of a wall of fire. To understand the cognitive shock that captured Germans experienced when they finally saw the inside of an American supply zone, you have to look at the numbers on both sides. By December of 1944, a single American armored division, in active combat, was burning approximately 100,000 gallons of motor fuel every day. During the Great Pursuit across France in August and September of 1944, General George Patton's 3rd United States Army had, on certain days, consumed 800,000 gallons of fuel in a single 24-hour period. The American supply lifeline that fed this consumption was a wonder of industrial logistics. From the 25th of August to the 16th of November, 1944, the Red Ball Express truck convoy system had run continuously, 83 days, with at peak nearly 6,000 trucks on the road, hauling 412,000 tons of supply forward to the armies. Across the English Channel, the British engineers had laid down 17 separate undersea pipelines, collectively known as Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, which by the end of the war had pumped over 200 million American gallons of fuel from England to France. The newly opened port of Antwerp had 498 storage tanks on 208 acres of dockyard, with a combined capacity of 124 million gallons of petroleum products. Now look at the German side. The Wehrmacht, in 1944, had produced 1,105,000 metric tons of aviation gasoline against a consumption of 1,403,000 tons. They had produced 1,471,000 tons of motor fuel against a consumption of 1,805,000 tons. In both categories, they were burning down strategic reserves faster than they could replace them. The synthetic fuel industry that had supplied roughly half of all Wehrmacht fuel had been smashed. The Lohne plant, the largest single producer in the Reich, had been hit by 22 raids, 6,552 bomber sorties, and 18,328 tons of bombs in a single year, and had operated, on average, at 9% of its capacity. The 6th SS Panzer Army, which contained Joachim Peiper's spearhead, had been allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive, approximately 4 million gallons of fuel. A single American forward fuel dump near Stavelot held nearly as much. That is the core statistic. That is why this episode, this 9-day fight in a corner of Belgium, became the moment when the entire German officer corps finally understood, in their bones, that they had lost the war. Not at Stalingrad, not at Kursk, not on D-Day. Here, in the snow, watching American boys pour American gasoline that the Americans had so much of that they could afford to set 124,000 gallons of it on fire just to make a road look bad to a German tank crew that was never, "I'm going to drive up the road anyway." The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the comprehensive post-war Allied investigation into the effects of the air campaign, reached a verdict on this question that has never been seriously challenged. The survey wrote, in its summary report dated the 30th of September, 1945, that when the Germans launched their counter-offensive on the 16th of December, their reserves of fuel were insufficient to support the operation. They counted on capturing Allied stocks. Failing in this, many Panzer units were lost when they ran out of gasoline. By the 21st of December, Joachim Peiper was no longer attacking. He was being slowly compressed. His remaining strength had concentrated in 3 small Belgian villages along the Amblève. The largest was La Glaise, a hilltop hamlet of stone houses, and 1 small church. American attacks from the north and west, conducted by elements of the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 3rd Armored Division, were squeezing him in. The senior American prisoner in Peiper's hands at this point was a major named Hal McCown of the 2nd Battalion, 119th Infantry, 30th Division. McCown was held in Peiper's command post in La Glaise. He spent several days observing the SS colonel at close quarters. He survived to write a detailed after-action report, which the historian Michael Reynolds later reproduced in his biography, The Devil's Adjutant. McCown wrote that Peiper, on the night of the 21st of December, was completely confident in Germany's ability to whip the Allies. Peiper spoke at length about Heinrich Himmler's new reserve army, saying it contained so many new divisions, both armored and otherwise, that American intelligence officers would wonder where they all came from. It was a fantasy. By the 21st of December, the 6th SS Panzer Army was already breaking on the steel rim of Elsenborn Ridge. The 12th SS Panzer Division had been gutted by the dug-in defenders of the 99th Infantry Division and the artillery of the 2nd Infantry Division. The 5th Panzer Army to the south was making more ground, but it too was running out of fuel and time. Across the entire front, the great offensive had bulged forward 50 miles into the Allied lines, but had failed to take a single one of its operational objectives. On the 23rd of December, two things happened that ended any possibility of German victory. First, the weather cleared. The fog that had grounded Allied tactical aviation for a week burned off. By mid-morning, the sky over Belgium filled with the distinctive engine note of thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, B-26 Marauders, and British Typhoons. German columns on every road were being slaughtered from the air. The German chief armoured officer, Horst Stumpf, would later tell his American interrogators that the Allied air attacks had laid bomb carpets on the roads and railways and throttled an already inadequate supply system. Second, at 2 in the afternoon, the regimental commander Wilhelm Mohnke gave Peiper permission to break out. At 5 in the afternoon, formal orders came from Corps. Peiper was to break out to the east with his vehicles and his men. Peiper read the order and immediately understood, as he later told Hechler, that the only chance was to break out without vehicles and without the wounded. In the early morning hours of the 24th of December, 1944, Christmas Eve, the soldiers of Kampfgruppe Peiper placed demolition charges on every armoured vehicle they had left. At 1 in the morning they assembled in the village square at La Glise, approximately 800 men, on foot. They walked out into the woods. What they left behind, in the small streets of La Glise and in the villages around it, became the most photographed German equipment graveyard of the Western War. The exact tally, compiled by Belgian historian Gérard Grégoire and now housed at the Musée December 1944 in La Glise itself, is preserved in the records. 6 King Tigers, the 68-ton heavy tanks that were supposed to break through to the Meuse, 13 Panthers, 7 Panzer IVs, 47 half-tracks, 6 self-propelled 15-centimetre heavy infantry guns, 3 Puma armoured cars, 1 Wirbelwind anti-aircraft tank, plus dozens of trucks, motorcycles, Schwimmwagen amphibious cars, captured American jeeps. In the surrounding villages, more Panthers, more Tigers. In total, approximately 135 armoured vehicles, abandoned by a single battle group in a single 9-day operation. Major McCown was with the column when it slipped out of La Glise. He wrote that at 5 in the morning, they heard the first tank blow up, and inside 30 minutes the entire area formerly occupied by Peiper's command was a sea of fiercely burning vehicles, the work of the small detachment Peiper had left behind to complete the destruction of all his equipment. What followed for the men who had broken out was a 36-hour forced march through deep snow in sub-zero temperatures, with no food, no rest, no chance of resupply. A Luftwaffe flak sergeant named Karl Lohn, who survived the march, left an account of what it was like. Lohn wrote that a burning thirst, caused by the dry cold, bothered them most. The men, he said, tore the ice-covered snow from the trees and sucked it. Others, he wrote, threw themselves animal-like over each puddle and drank the muck. When they took a 5-minute break, some fell asleep on their feet, did not wake up when the march resumed, and were never seen again in the darkness. On the morning of the 25th of December, Christmas Day, the survivors of Kampfgruppe Peiper reached friendly lines near the village of Wanne. The historian Michael Reynolds, working from the German records, gives the figure of 770 men who crossed back over the Salm River out of an original Kampfgruppe strength of close to 5,000. Peiper himself, sitting with a doctor that morning, counted only the men he had personally led into Belgium. He said they had left with 3,000 men, and now they had 717. Whichever figure you take, the meaning of it was not in dispute. A battle group that had crossed the start line 9 days earlier as the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division was now reduced to a column of exhausted infantry walking out of a Belgian forest in deep snow without a single working vehicle to its name. 8 months after the wreckage of his Tigers at La Glise, in September of 1945, Joachim Peiper sat at a wooden table in a prisoner of war facility in Bavaria and answered the questions of the American historian in uniform. Major Kenneth Hechler had been sent to collect operational accounts from senior German officers as part of what the United States Army called the Foreign Military Studies Program. Peiper was a particularly important interview subject for 2 reasons. First, he had commanded the spearhead of the entire German Ardennes offensive. Second, he was simultaneously under investigation for the war crimes committed at Honsfeld, at Bullingen, at the Baunes crossroads, and elsewhere. The Malmedy massacre trial was coming. Peiper knew it. Hechler, in the opening notes of his interview report, was unsparing about the man across the table from him. He wrote that Peiper was a very arrogant, typical SS man, thoroughly imbued with Nazi philosophy. He wrote that Peiper was very proud of his regiment and division and was inclined to make derogatory remarks about other units. He wrote that Peiper was possibly frightened about his future disposition. And then Hechler wrote a sentence that explains the strange quality of the entire transcript. He wrote that as soon as it became apparent the conversation would be confined to military tactics and not to war crimes, Peiper opened up. Peiper spoke good English, Hechler noted, and took particular delight in correcting the interpreter. The interview that resulted, which the Army catalogued as Ethint 10, runs to dozens of pages of single-spaced transcript, now held by the National Archives in Record Group 549. It is the closest thing we have to a complete operational confession from the spearhead commander of Hitler's last offensive, taken in his own words, with the body of a Panzer division still rusting in the snow behind him. And in that document, on page after page, in calm and precise English, Joachim Peiper admits the thing his commanders had refused to admit, even to themselves. He admits that the operation had been planned with the assumption of captured American fuel. He admits that he had been told, in advance, where the American dumps were. He admits that the map he had carried into Belgium had shown him Bulge and Stavelot. He admits that it had not shown him Francochamps. He admits that when his lead Panther rolled to a stop on the night of the 18th of December, he had no idea what had been in the forest 300 yards away. The story of the Battle of the Bulge is the story of two numbers. 4 million gallons of fuel issued to an entire German army for an offensive aimed at the English Channel. 3 million gallons of fuel sitting in 5-gallon American jerrycans in one Belgian forest, guarded by 60 Belgian fusiliers and a single platoon of black American gas handlers, 300 yards from the lead tank of an SS colonel who never knew they were there. He never knew it was there. The Foreign Military Studies project, of which Hechler's Peiper interview was one tiny piece, eventually produced thousands of pages of post-war German testimony. Read together, those documents form an extraordinary chorus of senior officers, slowly, painfully, in the polite bureaucratic German of military reports, admitting that they had lost the war to a logistical machine they could not match. General Horst Stumpf, the OB West chief armoured officer, told his interrogators that the bulk of the fuel reserves had been located along the Rhine River, and once it snowed, could not be brought forward because of the intolerable road conditions. For this reason, Stumpf said, they could only use a small number of the tanks available to them, and, in addition, lost many of their tanks through lack of fuel. General Hasso von Manteuffel, the commander of 5th Panzer Army, the army that operated to the south of Peiper, gave the verdict the most starkly. Manteuffel told the British historian Basil Liddell Hart, in interviews conducted after the war, that the fuel which had been promised never arrived because the railways could not move it forward in time, owing to Allied air attack. Manteuffel later reflected that the fact they were compelled to blow up such a large number of tanks during the retreat in January of 1945 was mainly due to the fact that they had too few recovery vehicles, which in turn was caused by fuel shortages. Manteuffel estimated that the number of tanks they lost because of this lack of recovery vehicles was 5 times higher than the number they lost in battle. 5 times more tanks lost to lack of fuel than to American fire. Sepp Dietrich, the commander of 6th SS Panzer Army, Peiper's own army commander, the old First World War Sergeant Hitler had promoted to the leadership of the Reich Premier Panzer Formation, offered the most plaintive post-war summary. He said that all he had to do was cross the river, capture Brussels, and then go on to take the port of Antwerp. The snow, he said, was waist-deep, and there was not room to deploy 4 tanks abreast, let alone 6 armoured divisions. It did not get light until 8 in the morning, and was dark again at 4 in the afternoon. His tanks, Dietrich said, could not fight at night. And all this, he added bitterly, at Christmas time, the man whose offensive it really was, Adolf Hitler, made no post-war statement of any kind. He shot himself in a bunker in Berlin on the 30th of April, 1945. The military historian Peter Caddick-Adams, writing 70 years later, summarized the entire campaign in a single sentence that no honest reader of the records can really argue with. He wrote that the German assault was doomed to failure from the start. There is one final piece of this story that does not appear in any single document, because it cannot be reduced to a single quote. It is the slow, accumulating shock that captured German officers experienced as they passed through American rear areas in the spring of 1945. The German General Staff had been told, throughout the war, that American industrial output was a propaganda exaggeration. They had been told this so consistently that, even as their armies began to be overrun in the early spring of 1945, many of them still half believed it. And then they were captured. Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, told the British historian Basil Liddell Hart that the mobility of his forces had decreased steadily and rapidly under the weight of Allied air attack on the supply roads behind the front. Albert Speer would later write in his memoir Inside the Third Reich that the catastrophe of Hitler's war machine in the West had been, at the most basic level, a catastrophe of oil. The American 8th Air Force and British Bomber Command had broken the synthetic fuel industry that the entire Wehrmacht ran on, and there had never been any real way to replace it. But the deepest understanding came when senior German prisoners were finally allowed to see what they had been fighting. The Germans had known, in some abstract sense, that American production was larger than German production. They had not understood the scale. They had not understood what a single American forward supply depot looked like in the flesh. They had not understood that the fuel dump Joachim Peiper had stumbled into at Bullingen, 50,000 gallons, the dump that had been a lucky break for him, was the smallest size of forward fuel installation the American First Army maintained. A dump like Francorchamps, with up to 3 million gallons of gasoline in stacked jerrycans under the pines, was, in the American supply system, simply normal. There were others like it all the way back to the English Channel, fed by pipelines under the sea and by truck convoys running day and night, and by a port at Antwerp that could hold more petroleum products in its tanks than the entire German Reich produced in 3 months of synthetic fuel work. The Germans were fighting from a synthetic fuel base that had produced just 17,000 tons in the month their offensive was launched. The Americans were fighting from a continent. This is the moment that captured Germans, in their post-war letters and memoirs and veterans' interviews for the rest of their lives, kept coming back to. Not the moment of surrender, not the moment of formal defeat. The moment when they finally saw, with their own eyes, the size of the American supply tail behind a single American division. What they had been fighting was not an army, it was a continent. That, in the end, is what cognitive dissonance looks like in the German post-war interrogation files. Joachim Peiper, the commander whose Tigers and Panthers had driven deeper into Belgium than any other unit of Hitler's last offensive, sitting across a table from a young American historian in a prisoner of war camp in Bavaria, hearing for the first time that he had passed within 300 yards of 3 million gallons of American gasoline, shrugging his shoulders, smiling that small, arrogant smile, and saying in his polite English, "I am sorry." He was sorry. He should have been. Because the gasoline that he never saw was the difference between an offensive that might have reached Antwerp and an offensive that died in a Belgian forest on Christmas Eve. The Battle of the Bulge was decided in Bullingen at 7 in the morning on the 17th of December, when 50 American prisoners were forced to pour American fuel into German tanks. It was decided in a road cut south of Francorchamps on the 18th of December, when Major Solis set 124,000 gallons of gasoline on fire to make a road look bad. It was decided in the woods between Spa and Stavelot, where black American truck drivers worked under fire to evacuate 2 million more gallons. It was decided at the timber trestle at Habiemont, where Lieutenant Edelstein blew a bridge in the last seconds before the lead Panther came around the bend, and then heard the SS colonel on the other side of the gorge scream those 3 words. Those damned engineers. It was decided, above all, in the empty fuel tanks of the German trains that never reached the Rhine, and in the silent synthetic fuel plants that the American 8th Air Force had broken month after month all through the summer of 1944. The Germans did not lose the Battle of the Bulge to the cold. They did not lose to the snow. They did not lose to the resistance of any one American division, brave as those divisions were. They lost to a logistical machine they had been hearing rumors about for years and refused, until the very last moment, to believe was real. Joachim Peiper survived the war. He served 11 years in prison for the Malmedy massacre before his sentence was commuted, lived in France under an assumed name, and was murdered in his own home in July of 1976, in the village of Treves in eastern France, in a fire of disputed origin. His killers were never found. The Americans who burned the gasoline at Francorchamps went home, married their sweethearts, raised families, and mostly never spoke of what they had done that day. Major Paul Solis was awarded the Silver Star and lived a long, quiet life. The Belgian fusiliers who had guarded the dump went back to their villages. The black American truck drivers of First Army went back to a country that, for another 20 years, would not seat them at the front of a public bus. If you drive south from Spa towards Stavelot today, on a quiet summer afternoon, you can stop near the deep cut where Solis set his fire. The road is shaded now by tall pines that have grown up since the war. The smell of wood smoke in the air, when it is there, is from somebody's chimney. But under those trees, 8 decades ago, sat 3 million gallons of high-octane gasoline, and on the road below, in the dusk of the 18th of December, 1944, an SS colonel in a Panther tank turned away from a burning wall of flame and looked for another way west, never knowing that the difference between victory and annihilation had been measured, in the end, not in courage and not in tactics, but in how many 5-gallon jerrycans a country 8,000 miles away could load onto how many trucks and ships and pipelines and forward depots and deliver to a forest in Belgium in time. On the morning of the 17th of December, 1944, in a cattle market in a small Belgian town, an SS colonel stood and watched 50 American prisoners pour American gasoline into German tanks. He thought in that moment that it was a lucky break. It was not a lucky break. It was the answer to a question the German General Staff had been refusing to answer honestly for 3 years. They had already lost.